EU says it's ready to respond if US trade talks fail, but at what cost? This is Macro Matters, and we're talking trade. The US has paused some tariffs for 90 days, even as it escalated its trade war against China, leaving Europe stuck in the middle. EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen has said Europe is ready to respond if trade talks are unsuccessful, including with taxes on big tech. George Buckley is Chief European Economist at Nomura. George, after a week of contradictory news from the White House, the big tariffs threatened this week could in theory be back in 90 days. So where does the EU go from here?
Well, it's a good question, and it really depends upon what the US does and how the negotiations, assuming that there are some between now and the next 90 days, go. You'd hope to think that the EU and the US could come to some sort of agreement, but I think when it comes to the current US administration, it's very difficult to know where the final end point is for any of this is going to be. I'd be very surprised at this point if it turns out that there are no extra tariffs. We already know that there's 10% on pretty much everything, plus also 25% on autos. The EU has held off, as you said, from responding to that, but I'd be very surprised if we don't end up with something at all, and that in itself would be negative. There are also repercussions from what they're doing on China, what the US is doing on China, if that stays in place for European growth and European prices and inflation. So I think that's also worth bearing in mind as well.
I'll come back to China in a minute, George, but what leverage does Europe have, do you think?
Well, they are a big trading bloc. Donald Trump probably would like to have better relations, particularly on trade with Europe. Europe probably is going to go down the route of spending more money on defence. Some of that, not all of it. They want a lot more of it, the procurement, to come from within the EU, but some of it inevitably will come from the US. So they could offer, for example, to buy more US produce, but that will all be part of the negotiations, and I'm sure that this will be more obvious over the next few months.
As you already mentioned, the escalating trade breakdown between the US and China means that China needs to look for new markets. How worried should Europe be about the dumping of Chinese goods?
I think they should be very worried, and it might even be difficult to work out whether dumping is happening or whether it's simply the case that very weak CPI and producer price inflation in China is simply pulling down on prices more generally. If you look at a chart, for example, of Chinese export prices generally against European import prices generally, there's a very close correlation indeed, which does suggest that what happens in China doesn't stay in China. It has huge repercussions outside of China and in the EU as a whole. So if you start to see China with excess goods, it could pull down on inflation, and even without explicit dumping, it could generate a further fall in prices, which could ultimately end up being seen in Europe as well in their import prices.
Is it possible that this could actually bring Europe closer to China in the sense that it can portray itself as a more stable trading partner than the US at the moment?
I mean, I don't think the EU would be particularly happy if it was the case that dumping of Chinese goods at below cost price, for example, in Europe was to happen. So I'm not sure that would help on the sort of closeness, if you will. But of course, it could mean that trade between Europe and China steps up. And I think we've seen this with a number of initial discussions. You've seen it in the UK, for example, where there's a desire to be much more closely aligned with other countries to try and offset some of the Trump tariffs. So it may be the case that there is an improvement in negotiations in trading partners between all countries in the EU and other countries apart from the US, whether that be including China or not. I think you will see a great deal more of global cooperation outside of the US.
That was George Buckley of Nomura. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.